Stefan från Arrow här och med mig har jag idag
Silla från Fokus, CyberS, som numera är en del av OpenText.
Spännande. Varför är vi här idag då, Silla?
Vi har tillsammans med vår presale spelat in härliga sessioner kring applikationssäkerhet. Vi kommer köra ett webbinarserie här i vår.
Hi everybody and welcome to this second part of this webinar around application security. I want to introduce Jonathan, our speaker today, and he will talk about reducing open source risk. And Jonathan is an expert within this area about application security. So Jonathan, please introduce yourself and go ahead, and we see at the end.
Yeah, thank you, Cecilia, and welcome again to this webinar, part 2 of 3. In the first topic a few weeks ago, we talked about application security testing in general, but this time in the part 2, we will be focusing on reducing your open source risk and talking about software bill of materials and how you prevent attacks like the Log4j one. So who am I? I work for OpenText. I'm a pre-sales consultant here in the Nordics, based in Sweden. I am passionate about security, passionate about open source, passionate about development. I'm also one of the leaders of the local OWASP chapter here in Jönköping, Sweden. And I have Twitter, so if you want to follow me on Twitter, that's my handle. So OpenText, just a very brief summary here. We are a very big company, 25,000 experts strong, global company. We have over 100,000 customers. And we have a very broad portfolio within IT and tech. And our part of OpenText is called OpenText Cybersecurity, with a broad portfolio of many different security products, a lot of customers, and a lot of products you probably already heard of, especially Fortify, which is the part I'm working for. Fortify is a broad and very mature application security platform that supports a large number of different systems and languages, and gives companies around the world the confidence to release code and release products quickly and efficiently. So in general, today with AppSec, we see a very big trend. We have more applications. More and more companies have to release apps or publish web pages or have automated systems somewhere. And these applications are more and more frequently having new releases. So we can see from a study we did a few years ago that the number of releases increase, the number of apps increase, but also this means that the number of releases with critical vulnerabilities also increase. These vulnerabilities, they're no joke. They can bring down a company if they're really bad. They can cause massive fines. For instance, if you leak public or leak private information about customers, then laws like GDPR are really dangerous to you and give huge fines. Not to talk about the risk of reputation loss, or even more damaging things. So application security is important for companies today. Almost every company today has apps. Almost every company has the risk of releasing something that is a critical vulnerability. And having a good application security program is important to manage your risk. And in this seminar here, we will talk about the risk from open source. Verizon releases a very good report every year called the Data Breaches Investigations Report. And in the last year's report, they looked at where the attack vectors are coming from when they look at data breaches. And of course, social engineering is the #1 attack vector, in which you try to fool someone like with phishing emails or something else. But #2 here is basic web application attacks relating to application security. That's one of the most common ways of entering a system is through their web apps. And do you have a web app somewhere? Well, in that case, you should know how to secure it. There's also compliance reasons for looking at application security. For instance, in the critical information security CIS controls, that's a very popular formal framework for, Center of Information Security controls. One of the main controls, number 16, is relating to application software security. And in this compliance framework, they will ask you when you have the audit, do you have any application security program? Do you train your developers in secure coding? What if you find a vulnerability? Can you handle it? What will happen? And so on and so on. And in the context of open source, there's a lot of work to be done here in the industry. So what is open source, or what is software composition analysis? Well, I'm a car guy, so I like car analogies. A car is not just a car, it's made of hundreds or thousands of different components. This is the classic image here from Volkswagen, where they took apart their Golf a number of years ago. So a lot of things in a car, and this is an old car. Today's cars are much more complex. The same with our software. We have not just our own first-party code that we wrote ourselves, code that our developers are responsible for, but in fact, more than half, or in some cases even up to 80% of a typical program now consists of third-party code, or in most cases open source code. You say, hang on, what do you mean 80% is code that I haven't written myself? Yeah, that's true. Many of your programs are including libraries, and these libraries perform miscellaneous tasks for your application, important tasks. And looking at things, the majority of the code in your system is going to be not written by you. Looking back at the car analogy here, the car manufacturer depends on a number of subcontractors to supply them with the correct components. And if those components have weaknesses or defects, that's going to affect the first-party car manufacturer. Same for you. It doesn't matter that it's not your fault that there's a vulnerability in one of your components. You are still responsible for the code that you're publishing yourself, and you have a responsibility to your customers. So in the hardware industry, in the manufacturing industry, we have something called a BOM, or a bill of materials. That is a list of all your components that you include in your product. And there's a new thing in the software industry called the SBOM. SBOM stands for Software Bill of Materials. That's a manifest that will answer the questions, what components are you including? So if you have your application, if you have your API, and if you have your runtime, well, under the hood, there's going to be packages and different versions, going to be dependencies, you have relationships between them, you have licenses, and you have suppliers. All of these things are going to be described by your SBOM. So then the question is, do you have an SBOM? Or is an SBOM important? Well, the answer to the last question is easy. In the US, Joe Biden recently signed an executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity. And in this executive order, there's a requirement for governmental authorities to maintain an accurate and up-to-date data on their software bill of materials. It even mentions SBOM by name here. It requires the purchaser to provide it requires someone to provide the purchaser with an SBOM. And that's interesting. Can you provide an SBOM for your software? Well, we are here to help. So in a typical CI/CD pipeline, let me just show you a small recap of what we talked about last time. So application security, in my opinion, stands on three major pillars. First, we have SCA, which is software composition analysis or open source analysis, what we'll talk about today. We also have something called SAST, which is static application security testing. This is very closely related to SCA because SAST and SCA are both done early on in the SDLC. So when you do coding, when you select your code packages, when you commit and build and do unit tests, this is where SAST and SCA lives. It has source level access to your code when you do your scans, and it can give you a lot of good findings related to that. Later on in the chain, you will no longer work with source code. With the integration tests, in the review and the staging testing, you will be running acceptance tests, you will be running functional testing, and this is where DAST comes in. In dynamic application security testing, we will take your running code and put it in a test bench and then send requests to it and see what happens. That's the very, very short explanation. DAST is good at finding holistic attacks like authentication attacks or broken systems in different ways. So SCA, SAST, and DAST work together to secure your entire SDLC. So we have a different product areas we will want to talk about today. I want to talk about security vulnerabilities, license compliance, and community health. So what do all these mean? Well, in this terms of security vulnerabilities, then you want to know if there are any vulnerabilities in the components that you use. For instance, here is a package called JSON schema, and there's a published advisory for it that JSON schema is vulnerable to prototype pollution. It says here in the description that this package JSON schema before version 040 is vulnerable to an improperly controlled modification of object prototype attributes. Prototype pollution are a very interesting type of attack where you can inject more data than the developer maybe thought possible. It was found not very long ago actually, so it's been making the rounds in the AppSec community. So this is an example here. There's a published advisory. First of all, do you know if you're vulnerable to this? Do you know if you're using this JSON schema package? And if you are using it, are you using anything of JSON schema that's actually triggering this vulnerable part? Maybe this is a big library and using just a small part of it. These are very, very interesting questions to ask and to answer. We know that 99% or 98% of all commercial applications here, not just applications, but even commercial applications, they have open source. And as I mentioned before, almost 80% of the code base today consists of open source software. So these vulnerabilities are important to keep track of. New vulnerabilities like the one I just showed you are released every day. Some of them are not very critical, some of them are very critical. In December 2021, we had the log4j vulnerability, which was a massive thing for the industry. Log4j is used in basically all Java applications, and Java is very popular. And this vulnerability was really, really critical. It's one of the worst we've ever seen, and it was very easy to trigger. So it was the perfect storm. But what if there's going to be something tomorrow, something new, some other component that's extremely critical? The first question you will want to answer is, do you even have this as a part of your system? Just answering the question, well, this software definitely not vulnerable. That's a great start for your incident response team. And also for an attacker, it is, I'm mixing up. So why is it then important to find the security vulnerabilities? Well, obviously for an attacker, it's very easy when it comes to open source security to understand that you are using a vulnerable part of an open source project. So it's much easier to do that than to figure out quote unquote normal type of vulnerability, which is like a logical error, for example, somewhere in the code. So an attacker will quite quickly know that your application has this vulnerable, say, JSON parser package, and can then craft an attack for it and exploit the software. That's why it's very important to keep track of your open source dependencies. So what should you do about it then? Well, of course, as I said, know which vulnerabilities exist in your code base and their severity. Then when that's done, you will need to prevent any new vulnerabilities from entering your production environment. And also then fix the vulnerabilities that you already have. So in this prevention part, you can create a safety net by thinking about security testing, just as we did any other testing. If you work with software, you're very familiar with unit testing, integration testing. You should also be thinking about security testing. And then we can say a policy that these tests need to pass before things are merged into production. So finding and fixing security vulnerabilities is important, and our tools will help you do that. The next part is going to be license and compliance. So what is license and compliance? Well, an open source license regulates how you're allowed to use, modify, and redistribute the library it regulates. And if for some reason an open source package that you are using does not have a license, well, bad news. Then it defaults to the local copyright law of the creator's country. And there's a lot of countries in the world, a lot of jurisdictions, a lot of local and state laws that might apply. So you need to know what you can and cannot include. If, for instance, there's licenses that are very copyleft, like the GPL license, well then if you include that in your closed source proprietary software, then you're legally required to publish your source code as well. So there are many things that you can run into with licensing that are important to manage. I'm not saying open source software is bad for this case. I'm just saying you need to manage your risk, you need to manage your licenses. First of all, there's permissive licenses. You can basically do anything with the code. Often this means you need to do something called attribution. So saying, okay, so we include, say, curl, which is a very popular software that's communicating over HTTP. You need to say that we are using curl and it's copyright by this guy and for these years and so on. That's a permissive license. Then there's a strong copyleft license, as I mentioned. So there was a car manufacturer not long ago that was discovered to have actually used strong copyleft code in their code, and they published it they used it in their cars. In the end, they were forced to publish their own source code for the rest of the car. And that was probably not what the car manufacturer intended to do. Then there's also weak copyleft code. Then, for instance, the LGPL is a weak copyleft library license. So if you're using the library as in linking the code, then you can use it together with in-house code. So an example here would be, as I said, the LGPL, and a strong copyleft case is the normal GPL code. There's also some other license types, like you have to buy me a beer if you want to use my software. Well, that's nice and all, but can you really use this in a commercial software? Can you probably run into legal issues? As much possible. I don't know. I mean, I'm not giving legal advice here. I'm not a lawyer, but you have to think about these things for a minute before you include open source software. You have to know the licenses. But how can you know the licenses? Well, first of all, again, you need to know what licenses you have. Then you need to prevent these unwanted licenses from entering your code base. And in the last case, you need to remove libraries with unwanted licenses. So again, we can, with our tooling, create a safety net for you by thinking about license testing just as the way you did with automated testing. And again, we can make tests for this, and the tests need to pass before you can merge your code. Then there's also the last part, which we call community health. So open source projects can be healthy or they can be unhealthy. And you want to ensure that you're using well-maintained projects. The best way to reduce your vulnerabilities in the first place and have good licensing is actually choose high quality open source software to begin with. And this is basically like choosing any other kind of software. The difference is that the open source software is brought in without putting a lot of thought into the state of the component. For instance, if a product which is critical to your infrastructure is being maintained by just one single person, what's to say that that person will continue to work? How good are the maintainers at solving security vulnerabilities? And is the community for this component growing or declining? And all these aspects are extremely important but very difficult to evaluate. In our database, we have pulled in data for over 28 million open source projects and consolidated them into something called Open Source Select, a huge database of open source software and the projects and their community health. So you can integrate this with your CI/CD flow, and you can even get immediate feedback whenever you're looking for new software to include. Now, this is for the enterprise only version, but it's very useful to reduce vulnerability risk and license risk by selecting these high quality tools. So a quick screenshot from our tools here, a very basic demo. First of all, we'll be looking at vulnerability issues here. So in this case, we have done a static scan, and we've also done a software composition analysis of a software using the source code. And we found a lot of findings. And one of the findings here was related to open source security. In this case, we found that we're using PostgreSQL, a very popular database for relational databases. And in summary, we have found a critical security hole in this JDBC driver for the Java project. And I think this one even had remote code execution, a really bad type of vulnerability. We show the CV number here, which is 2022-21724, and the vulnerable version is 42.2.18. Now our tool will, first of all, give you the next non-vulnerable version. So this is a version you can upgrade to remediate this issue. but there's even a newer version available beyond that, so you can upgrade to 42.5.4. That's the latest release, and that's also not vulnerable. And remember me talking about the SBOM? Well, we can also give you an SBOM straight away. So this way you can comply with this governmental compliance requirement by, you got your SBOM ready to go, and that part for your work is done. This screenshot is from our tool called Fortify on Demand, and it integrates straight with our open source analysis tool. So that's all and good, but can we go beyond SCA? Remember in the last webinar I talked about shifting left, where you start early on to do security testing. We also want you, of course, to start early on to do software composition analysis. And it works like this: you import a dependency, you write your code, and then here's when you do their security testing before pushing to CI, and then the CI job might fail. That's shifting left. Well, what if you can instead start left, go in even further? What if before you even write your code and your CI job fails here at the end? What if you can visit our tool called dbrick.com/select to view our open source select tool, and then search for the dependency you want and see immediately if it's compliant? Well, that's exactly what we can provide you. So if you go to our open source select tool, you can look for instance, React. Obviously, React is a very popular framework for web applications, but here we can give you instantly a lot of the information we've been looking for here. So you can see that there's a specific license called MIT and Apache. You can see our general scores for contributors in popularity and security. There's a lot of data in the web portal, but I want to bring out that the contributor score is quite high, it's 80%. The contributors are very experienced, we can see here. They might not be as efficient as other tools, but they're very diverse and have good longevity, and this gives a high score for contributors. For security, the score is a bit lower. That has mainly to do with that we can't really detect them following coding best practices. But this can give you a very nice overview of the tool. And even better, if you're using our enterprise versions and you're logged in, then you can actually see if this component will match your license policy. So before even having the CI test failed, you can see that the component passes or not. But this is not just for our enterprise customers. Anyone listening here, I should really recommend that you go to Open Source Select. It's a free tool for anyone to use if you want to. So you can search for these packages publicly and download our very rich database and see what we can find for your tools. So working with open source then, as we said, the big areas here are vulnerability management, license compliance, and community health. And you can set all these policies to be automated. You can enforce all these on an organization level. We don't want any vulnerable components. That's the first one here. We can set policies to warn you or fail your CI pipeline whenever a vulnerability is found. You can do the same for licenses. We don't want any components with a bad license for us. And then community health, you can even set flags for, we don't want anything using an unhealthy component, something that could be risky in the future. So our Fortify system and the brick tool will give you the full coverage here for your whole life cycle. You start here on the selection part, you do the coding part, and then you fix it also. So we can cover your whole SDLC for using open source tooling. I also want to mention some upcoming things or some good things that we can offer that many other tools in this field do not. Remember me talking about what version is safe and what version is unsafe and how you should upgrade. Well, many tools just give you information about which component update to be secure. Well, in this case, Jest here has a current version of 1.2.3, I think it says, and that's vulnerable not by itself, but because it has what we call a transitive dependency. So Jest depends on these other components in turn, and then on the end we can see a component called Lodash in version 2.2.0, and that one is vulnerable to a specific vulnerability. The next safe version is 2.4.0. But should you really be updating Lodash itself? Well, our tool can tell you that you should probably update Jest instead, because updating Jest from 1 to 3. I think it says 150. Then it will update to a safe version of Lodash, which is 2.4.0. So updating by the root, that's a very easy fix for fixing indirect dependencies. And giving this type of information is not very easy. So this will give you a much better better coverage of finding these open source vulnerabilities. We're also working on something called vulnerable functionality. That's currently in alpha for Java, but we hope to release that later on in 2023. So before, I might remember me talking about, are you using a vulnerable component? Yes or no? That's a very binary question. Maybe you're just using a part of that library. Maybe you're just using not a vulnerable part of a component. Well, this type of vulnerable functionality testing can actually test that for you. So you might not even need to update a package as long as you're not using the actual component itself. We have a working alpha here for Java, and the screenshot is from this working alpha. This can give you more fine-grained knowledge about what vulnerabilities you actually are exposed to. We're also working on breaking changes in order to find what versions will give you breaking changes in your code or not. So it can find if the change is made between a version, introduce a breaking change, and then finds if you're using part of the code that breaks. So again, helping your developers to more quickly weed out the unimportant stuff and focusing on fixing what's actually important. And this is something we also are planning to release for this year. So looking back to the bigger picture, our Fortify platform with the Brick tool gives you great security. So it's a very complete and mature platform, and that gives you both static testing, dynamic testing. It gives you open source testing, SCA, and it also gives you mobile application security testing, something I hope to talk more about to you in the future. Fortify on Demand is our cloud offering, a managed service where you can start as small as you want, but you can also grow big. So you pay as you go. If you just want to do one single static scanner of application, that's fine. We'll manage the whole setup. You don't need to do any installation or management or upgrades. We will take care of that for you. Then if you want to grow into open source analysis, if you want to grow into DAST, if you want to grow into mobile application security testing, we have got you covered there. So again, we talked about this new era of code security with DevSecOps, where we have a very good maturity of DevSecOps, but the adoption is very low. And we can offer you a large degree of automation in these tests. If you want to do security testing, you should not just focusing on doing it automated, or you should not just focusing on doing it manually. You should instead have automated security testing, something you can integrate easily into your existing CI/CD to give you confidence that you're not just fixing something today, but you're also making sure the vulnerabilities stay out. We have lots of increased threats, not just from the situation in Russia, but also in general, hackers are always increasing their attacks and they're not getting lazier. We can see API attacks increasing a lot last year, 85%, but also web application attacks and mobile application attacks are increasing. And a platform like Fortify will help you stay relevant and stay secure within this increasing threat landscape. That's all I had to say today about open source security. I hope I piqued your interest a bit. In the next and final part of this Great Code Demands Great Security webinar, part 3, I will be talking more about API security and how you can prevent your APIs from being compromised. That's going to be on the 5th of April. You can attend either locally in our office at Arrow in Kista in Stockholm, or you can also see it on the web as we do today. Cecilia, you want to bring us some more information about how we can learn more about these things?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jonathan. Perfect talk and explain about the open source scanning. As a partner, you can of course do a lot of training for us, and some part of that is to do digital training. Here is some of the one that we offer, and it's always come new stuff, new events, new webinars, new things. So look at the digital training, reach out to me or Maria, that is the part of business manager in this region, and also keep you update on the Unplugged site, because there we recording small shorts videos about topics. So again, thank you for you listen to us today, and keep be in contact with us. We will publish this webinars recordings on Arrow's website, and you can see that find that via our LinkedIn and that parts. So thank you for today, and Jonathan, thanks again for this session.
Thank you. See you next time.
And have a good day.